In 1954, we were introduced to a crime thriller movie that was directed by Alfred Hitchcock. That movie was Dial M for Murder. It starred Ray Milland, Grace Kelly, Robert Cummings, Anthony Dawson, and John Williams. Both the screenplay and the actual stage play on which it was based were written by English playwright Frederick Knott. You see, in 1953, Alfred Hitchcock was looking for a new project after a film that he had been working on and developing fell through. He sensed a need to go back to his safe space of murderous thrillers. He opted to adapt a stage play that had already proven to be a hit on British television. Dial M for Murder would ultimately become one of Hitchcock's best-known and best-loved classics. The film, in terms of locations and numbers of characters, is a relatively sparse film that barely leaves its primary set. And that's really because it's based on this stage play. Warner Brothers ended up buying the rights to the stage play for $75,000. By 1953, when the movie arrived at Warner Brothers, Hitchcock was developing a project called The Bramble Bush. This was a story of a man who steals another man's passport only to find out that the original owner is wanted for murder. Hitchcock struggled and wrestled with this story for a while, but he was never satisfied with it. When Dial M landed at the studio, Hitchcock knew the play because it had been a hit, and he opted to direct this instead. In the early 1950s, the 3D movie craze was raging, and Warner Brothers was eager to cash in on it and pair this up with the famed director. The studio ordered the director to use the process on this film. This meant that Hitchcock had to work with giant cameras necessary for the process of filming it. But there was also a trade-off that makes the film fascinating, even in 2D. In order to make the film look appropriately interesting in 3D, the famous director added a pit into the floor of the set so the camera could move at low angles and capture objects like lamps in the foreground. As a result, the film looks like no other Hitchcock ever shot, particularly for the infamous scissors that's at the film's thrilling centerpiece. Unfortunately, at the time that the film was released in 1954, the fad of 3D was dying out, so the film was shown in 2D at most screenings. This was Hitchcock's first film with Grace Kelly. Of all the iconic blonde stars that were cast in his films, the most famous is without a doubt Grace Kelly. The famed director described her as one of those rare things in movies, and that she was fit for any leading lady part. The story goes that these two had the easiest working relationship of any star that he had worked with. They got along great. They went on to work together after this in two more films, the first being Rear Window in 1954, and then To Catch a Thief in 1955. This entire shoot is almost entirely done indoors in basically one setting. And because it was a stage play first, this makes it so possible to do this and right up Alfred Hitchcock's alley. He couldn't stand to go outside of the studio. He loved to do everything on a sound stage, so he was tickled to death not to have to do any remote filming. You watch the entire movie, and you'll be hard-pressed to find anything that was done on location. Even the things that look like they were done outside are usually projection shots or matte paintings. With almost everything being shot in the Windus's apartment, this adds to the intimacy and tension of the shoot. The director has always been known as a meticulous director, obsessed with detail. And boy, that's really an understatement. But in this movie, he was unbelievably detail-oriented. And this was due primarily because he felt like the 3D cameras were going to capture objects in a way that his other films hadn't. As a result, he selected all of the objects in the Windus's apartment himself, and even had a giant false telephone dial made for the famous M close-up in the title sequence. His exacting eye also led to an elaborate color experiment to portray the psychological condition of Kelly's character. As the film begins, the colors she wears are very bright, suggesting a happy life in which she doesn't suspect anything is wrong at all. As the film grows darker for her, to the point that she's framed for murder, her wardrobe grows darker and more somber. Now you'll have to look a little bit closer in this film to find Hitchcock's cameo. He's always known throughout his career for making cameos in his films, ranging from very subtle things to more elaborate ones depending on the movie. In this film, his cameo falls somewhere in between. He's not actually in the film itself. He appears in a class reunion photo that's hanging on the wall in the Windus's apartment. He's seated at a banquet table among other men. So look quickly. It's pretty obvious when you know to look for it, but if you weren't, this cameo would slip right past you. At one point in the film, when Grace Kelly's character is more burdened with the things that are happening to her, Hitchcock instructed her to behave like she was in a trance, to make her seem completely detached and distant. This is really obvious, and she does an excellent job at pulling this off. The look in her eyes the entire time makes you think that she's completely confused at life and what's going on to her. Now, there's really an interesting bit of trivia that happens, and it happens in the part during the plan to expose the husband's involvement in the murder. The inspector has one of his policemen return the wife's handbag to the police station. When the policeman puts the bag over his shoulder and goes to leave, the inspector stops him with a warning that he could be arrested for doing that. The inspector then places the handbag inside his briefcase for the policeman. This line is strictly because the laws regarding sexual behavior in Britain were not changed until 1967. Before that, homosexuality was a criminal act, and thus this line made it into the film. It's almost said in a comical way, though. Now, in the 1950s, Grace Kelly was known as an aristocratic blonde beauty from Philadelphia. She had an air about her that was on another level. She appeared as a genteel, ultra-mannered lady who seemed above reproach, but she had a completely different side to her in Hollywood. Most people know her there as being one of the most sexually active women for that era of Hollywood. Her liaisons were legendary. They included romps with David Niven, William Holden, Gary Cooper, Bing Crosby, and many others, most of them being married men, which was a type that she favored as a father substitute. This film was no different. Ray Milland fell into her siren love trap too. Milland's wife was furious over this affair, and the famed actor was ready to leave his wife and marry Grace Kelly. There's a few people in Hollywood that she didn't have affairs with, one of them being Alfred Hitchcock, who directed her in 3 movies and was completely infatuated with her. And she also didn't sleep with Clark Gable, but it's said that she tried to woo him when they were filming Mogambo in Africa. Grace was so persistent that Gable finally invited her into his tent. There she got so drunk she eventually threw up, and this put an end to the possibilities of anything happening that night. All of her playful affairs aside, this lady is fun to look at and is an amazing actress. She has one of the best screen presence that you'll see in film, especially in that era. Take a look at this amazing Hitchcock film. I know you'll love it. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll continue to chase the classics.